A lot of Pokemon sprites look really bad, and even more look really badass. With each generation comes its own very distinct art style, and we've seen the sprites take on new interpretations and personalities as they've evolved over time. But sometimes, Father Time is not so kind. It's been a popular opinion that the series' jump to 3D was one of the worst things to happen to the way the Pokemon look in the game, with pretty much all their life and expressiveness sucked right out. And now it's really easy to miss those 2D sprites who had like infinitely more character and charm. That is, until Pokemon Scarlet and Violet released and really revived that energy and liveliness of the 3D models. Now that is a very briefly summarized version of the history of Pokemon sprites and models, and there are endless niche details packed into every single generation of Pokemon that truly bring them to life and give them their own unique set of qualities. I also want to preface this by saying I will be talking about the artwork as someone whose only art experience is one 2D art class in college, and this is my best work from that class, so just bear that in mind. With that out of the way, let's start where it all began, with the original sprites from Generation 1. With these being the original designs, there were definitely a lot of kinks to work out, and that's to be expected because there's literally nothing to base them off of. There wasn't a style guide for what a Pokemon is. At the same time, there's clearly a reason that Pokemon was such a massive sensation from the very start. As a whole, these sprites are very recognizable for their more bulbous shapes, the use of perspective, and more exaggerated proportions. And when I say bulbous shapes, yeah, I just mean some of them are kind of fat. Pikachu is obviously the most famous example of this, because everybody remembers when Pikachu was a chubby little rascal before he discovered Jenny Craig. Other less famous examples would be Farfetch'd with him puffing his chest out, Marowak and Kumar go to White Castle, Gengar used to be less evenly round and more round like my fourth cousin Dale, who starts his Saturday mornings off with a Michelob Ultra. That is to say, more concentrated in the central region. And that's to say, Gengar had a beer belly. Some of these sprites incorporated a very dramatic use of perspective. One of the most effective ones is Hitmonlee, who makes it work pretty well. Kingler tries, but he just kinda ends up looking like he's squishing his own face, which is pretty goofy. And then there's Articuno with its flowing, majestic tail. The exaggerated proportions are one of the key identifiers to a Generation 1 Pokemon for me, because some of these are just all over the place. The most egregious example is this well-known Golbat sprite, who looks like he accidentally found himself in the pizza dough at Tony's and got rolled out thin crust style. Chansey is supposed to be shaped like an egg, but this is more of a deformed avocado. It's really just odd shapes, like how Mankey's arms are perfectly round and have 0 joints, and then whatever the heck is going on with Machamp's arms. Even without all the fancy animations or 3D graphics, a lot of the Pokemon were still very expressive. I said a lot, not all. Tentacruel with its crossed arms and death stare is as cold and cruel as he's ever been. Haunter's evil grin looks more deranged and spooky than it ever was after, and Omastar is absolutely hitting that pose. Altogether, I think Gen 1 sprites looked a little bit wackier and more outlandish. And I think that's a big reason that made Pokemon so popular in the first place, because they conveyed so much emotion. Instead of playing it safe and having each one just be a normal pose, they went out of their way to make sure so many of them had a distinct personality. And when Generation 2 rolled around, they kept on taking those risks, leading to some of the most expressive and beautiful sprites we've ever seen. Generation 2 had a lot more to work with for their sprites, specifically more money. With a bigger budget and more resources, they could afford to make the Pokemon look a little bit more clearly defined. As a result, a lot of the Pokemon started to take on the appearance that we know and love today. Gen 2 sprites express a lot of movement and action even when they're not moving. Take, for example, both versions of Pidgeot, who in Silver looks like it's barreling towards you at Mach speeds its Pokedex entry says it's capable of. And then the Gold version, where its feather crest is kind of ruffled, reminding me of how Ghibli characters are animated when they get really angry or emotional. A ton of Pokemon look like they're predators about to pounce. Arcanine, Vulpix, Suicune, Steelix. Well, really Steelix is more like a snake about to strike, and then Slowbro, who is less of a strike or a pounce and more like a belly flop into the neighborhood pool. Other ones look like they're mid-pounce, such as Scyther, Stantler, Sneasel, Farfetch'd, Crobat, Tauros, and Umbreon, just to name a few. Speaking of Umbreon, the other version is one of the few where the Pokemon has its back turned, making it seem more cold-blooded and cool, and just really embodying the new Dark typing. Another great example of how a sprite can convey a Pokemon's personality and vibe. Now don't worry, I didn't forget about Pokemon Crystal, where they have actual movement when they're sent out. This early on though, the movement did feel a little bit stiff. Like a majority of them were just the Pokemon blinking and that's sorta it. But some were animated in a way that gave real expression and conveyed certain aspects of the Pokemon's design. Like how Houndoom howls toward the moon, or Chinchu's antenna light up. Some other noteworthy ones are the Pokemon that do this little swiping motion. Rapidash raring up the charge is nothing short of awesome. Chikorita does its signature leaf wave, and Steelix's segments turn like gears. This is the only time you can actually see Slugma's lava bubbles like popping up. And Hitmontop does his classic little twirl. And Politoed? We don't talk about Politoed. Due to what I'm assuming is just the Game Boy's limitations, the animations are a bit choppy and have this near stop motion like effect. And honestly, I think it's to their favor. It has that retro charm as a product of its time, and once again just has its own unique vibe. And speaking of a unique vibe, that brings us to a massive step up in visual quality with Generation 3. Personally, I think this is where they really mastered what sets a Pokemon apart from just some fantasy creature, and it really shows in some of the brand new sprites. Take Mudkip, Castform, and Spheal with their bright-eyed smiles, or Banette, Cacturn, and Seviper with their more mischievous grins, or even Slakoth or Whiscash, who have absolutely zero thought behind those eyes. The emotion conveyed by their expressions is plentiful, which the comparatively higher resolution makes really apparent on the GBA. The Pokemon's body language can also help convey certain characteristics, like Absol in mid-strut, which is weirdly reminiscent of that classic Bigfoot picture and emphasizes its lore as a mystic Pokemon who very rarely shows itself to people unless there's a natural disaster. Then Kirlia, who has that classic prim and proper ballet form, and her evolution Gardevoir, whose flowing dress is as elegant as ever. And then you've got Grumpig and Ludicolo, who clearly can't get the Mirror B theme out of their head because they've watched too many videos by MJ Shout out Michael, you're literally my inspiration. As much as I absolutely adore Gen 3 because it is my favorite generation, I don't want to say that it's completely perfect, because there honestly isn't as much imagination with some of the poses on the new sprites. A lot of them literally just stand there facing left and that's just kind of it, but I think that's intentional, making them essentially a blank canvas for future, more interesting interpretations. I think putting all the starter trios side by side here really illustrates my point. For new Pokemon, they really restricted their pose, so they're easily identifiable, as opposed to the old ones. Like, everyone knows what Bulbasaur looks like, so they're able to do this wacky handstand without fearing that everyone will just recognize Bulbasaur as the frog that does the handstand. Bulbasaur is not the only good-looking sprite from a previous generation. Swinub looks like he's smelling something wafting through the air, and clearly it smells divine. Skarmory's sprite is an absolute classic, with its wings imposingly spread out like a collection of knives. Apom is doing a straight-up handstand with his actual hands, and Tyranitar looks like he's about to eat me alive. Sometimes the smallest of details can really skyrocket the quality of a sprite. Spot the difference between Fire Red Charizard and Sapphire Charizard, where the Fire Red one has his palms facing upward in this evil genius-y way, almost as if to say, I am stronger than you and I know that for a fact. It's these tiny nuances that can really impact the meaning of each individual sprite, and that's something that makes 2D Pokemon so incredibly special. And all of that is without even considering that they got animations again when they're sent out. Can we go back to when they didn't move? Okay, I'm just kidding. Like everything so far, there are some that are great and others that are just kind of whatever. As a whole though, I'll say that a lot of these just kind of rock around, and not a cool rock like Kiss or Queen, and more like a Grandpa Oak drinking lemonade on his porch kind of rock. But honestly, I don't expect every single Pokemon to completely reinvent the wheel for every animation, so there's not really much wrong with the way it is, but it does make it really special when you get the cooler stuff, such as Magmar blowing out a little flame, Sableye just turning into the void for a second, or Spheal rolling around like the adorable little bouncy ball that it is. To be honest though, some animations really breathe life into some sprites that are kind of stale otherwise. Trico's animation definitely gives him more of an excited and happy to be here kind of vibe. Same thing for Marshtomp waving his fins around, which we gotta appreciate here because we all know what his fate was for a while there. And Torchic does this little pecking motion, which is a lot cuter here than it was when I visited Cousin Dale's chicken coop. Mawil's biting motion is nothing short of horrifying, and Slacking's belly scratch is also nothing short of horrifying, but for completely different reasons. Spoink is here to remind you that he is still moving and is, in fact, not going to die, regardless of what his Pokedex entry says, and Barboach thrashes around to remind you that, yeah, he might actually die. Generation 3 can definitely be seen as kind of a mixed bag, where many sprites were as good as they've ever been, while others are just very plain. I know I'm being super nitpicky because I just think they played it safe in Ruby and Sapphire, and to be clear, 99% of the sprites aren't bad. Some just seem to purposefully lack creativity. And if you want creativity, look no further than Generation 4 sprites were overall a lot more inspired with their new poses for newly introduced Pokemon. Once again, with a new console on the DS, meant higher quality on everything. So I think they realized they could be a little bit more fancy with their sprite designs without having to risk the Pokemon looking too obscured or weird. A perfect example of this is Hippowdon, who they totally could have just made stand on all fours like all the other quadrupeds, but instead have it sunk halfway in the sand, which is of course this Pokemon's biggest identifying feature, and makes it feel a lot more like an elemental beast rather than just some normal hippo. For some other examples, Skuntank has his leg propped up like he doesn't even know the definition of silent but deadly, he just knows deadly. Lucario has his hand outstretched like he's taunting his opponent, as well as his Platinum sprite, which has more of a knight kneeling before his master kind of vibe. And Frostlass eerily side-eyes her opponent, looking mischievous, malevolent, and seductive all at the same time, and her Pokedex entry should tell you this was very intentional. And Munchlax's eyes drift upwards as if he's constantly daydreaming about his next meal. Me too, big guy. Me too. These sprites do such an excellent job of helping the Pokemon really embody the central idea or theme that they were designed around. If you look at Hoenn sprites in Gen 4, I think it really solidifies my theory that they intentionally made the Pokemon more basic in their home game so they'd be more recognizable. That way they could get more creative with these later sprites. Shelgon is getting more airtime than I ever thought would have been possible for his little stub legs. And Slacking was pretty gross last gen, but this went from gross to straight up disgusting. Milotic swirls in a spiral and it looks so fluid and majestic, it's an insane upgrade from Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald. Speaking of serpents, Rayquaza's aura honestly just peaked here. With his tail flowing behind him and his arms outstretched, he just exudes power and authority and really embodies his lore as the boss of Kyogre and Groudon. And they especially made up for that boring Deoxys sprite with the animations. From here on out, I'm going to try not to spend too much time on older Pokemon, because I've already talked about some of them so much, and some of them keep getting repeated. But it's really awesome to see how they continue to innovate and incorporate new ideas for Pokemon that have already had so many sprites over the years. Like, it would have been so much easier for them to just copy and paste, essentially. But no, we do get new stuff, like Dancing Meganium, or Sad Vileplume falling over. Primeape is late for dinner and he is not happy. Emo Eyeshadow Zapdos, who thinks he's better than you because he's in a band, or even Dragonite's best Goku impression. I'm definitely just cherry picking the best of the best, but they really went the extra mile on these, and I think they deserve the love. I have been talking about still sprites and animated ones both kind of interchangeably, but I want to make sure I point out the best of the best specifically for the animated ones. The entire Chimchar line in Platinum becomes so energetic, with Chimchar and Monferno literally jumping for joy, and Infernape slamming his fist on the ground, which I have no clever remarks about aside from holy that is awesome. Buizel's tail does this little propeller thing, like that's Buizel's whole shtick, so it's nice to see that the animation really helps deliver his design philosophy. Drifloon does that thing that balloons do. Rotom Heat and Frost forms also open up their doors, and whoever owned that fridge was clearly a guy in his 20s, because that thing is empty. Spheel's Gen 3 animation was already goated, but this little clap he does now, they really just blew that one out of the water with the cuteness factor on this one. Seviper sprite is good on its own, but when he flicks the tongue around, yeah, that's big snake energy. Phrasing. And as a whole, there's just so many Pokemon whose movements seem more embellished and are overall so much more lively. I think Gen 4 sprites are incredibly polished and just look phenomenal. At every turn, they do such a good job of taking these characteristics of the Pokemon and really bringing that to life. And the poses are generally very creative, especially once Platinum came along. And they would still be amazing even if they were just completely still the entire time. But those quick animations when they're sent out are just the cherry on top of an already fantastic Pokemon Sundae. And if we're talking Pokemon Sundaes and animated sprites, I think Gen 5 has us completely covered. Chocolate covered with sprinkles. Pokemon Black and White sprites are universally the most expressive in the series, just completely filled to the brim with character, personality, and charm. It's easy to see why. They're fully animated now. What elevates them from just good to great is that they're animated beyond just an idle animation. Pretty much every Pokemon has some extra little movement or something it does to convey certain aspects of its design. Also, I know I'm using those same kind of phrases and words, but listen, I don't know how else to say it. Some of the best examples are the poster boys for Gen 5 themselves, Zekrom and Reshiram, who charge up or flare up their tails respectively. That little burst of color just really emphasizes their raw power and aura. It's just on another level. There are a million more examples of Gen 5 Pokemon alone, but to name a few, Snivy crosses his arms to give off that regal smugness that his line is known for. He even taps his foot and nods his head slightly, like this little really thinks he's better than you. Duat holds its Scout Chop, which you would never know it was detachable otherwise, which is so cool. Timber flips his log behind his back, and if this was 2016 when everyone was doing the bottle flip, he'd have taken the world by storm. Scraggy pulls up his pants and then lets them drop, and when they fall, it's even more hype than when the DVD symbol hits the corner. Darumaka tucks in his arms and legs, which more accurately conveys the idea of him being based off Japanese Daruma dolls. And Ferrothorn does this thing where he raises himself up and falls down, to make it look like he's actually hanging from the ceiling with his spikes. And the animation has like actual gravity to it. The normal idle animations can also be very interesting, often moving in a way that gives them more lifelike characteristics, such as the physics of Whimsicott's cotton swaying in the wind. The Solosis line's inner body floats around inside their weird slime membrane, which is a great example of a design that really works best after it's fully animated. The exact same idea goes for the Clink line. Like, these guys with their moving gears were absolutely designed with this new sprite style in mind, because a static sprite just wouldn't have nearly the same effect. And the elemental monkeys hop around, which I honestly just love when Pokemon do these little jumps. It just gives them this energeticness that can really easily be glossed over. And these simians are really glossed over. There's also Seismitoad, whose bulb things jiggle like they're full of water, and is the only time I can confidently say jiggle physics aren't cringe. And then Galvantula, whose legs all move at different intervals and makes it feel super creepy and accurately spider-like. And then there's of course plenty of older Pokemon whose new animations give them an entire new layer of context. Like Beedrill, who is non-stop trying to sting you, and is why I, as a 24-year-old man, still get terrified at the first sight of a wasp in the spring. Sandslash being able to ruffle his quills was entirely new to me. Granbull has the most I'm gonna beat you up and take your lunch money energy that he's ever had. And Smeargle actually looks like he's trying to paint something with his tail. Gallade thrusts his arm forward, which extends the blade of his arm, giving more insight into this Pokemon's actual intended biology. If there's one criticism I have, it's that at times the sprites look a little unpolished. They can look a little bit rough instead of having a nice smooth outline, and the animations look a tad choppy sometimes. But pixel art, by definition, isn't smooth. So it makes sense, and for as many sprites as there are, with as much imagination as each one has, I think it's acceptable. I personally value creativity over graphical quality. Overall, Generation 5 has some of the most visually striking sprites, thanks to their dynamic animations. And it may very well be the generation where Pokemon looked truly alive. However, a few years later came along a moment of time that went down in Pokemon history, when Generation 6 dropped and moved the series into the third dimension.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Yeah, I think Generation 6's new 3D models were practically the opposite of Gen 5 sprites. Not too shabby on the quality, but severely lacking in creativity. And by this point, you kind of come to expect a little bit more, especially after Gen 5. Remember what I said about how some Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire would just kind of stand facing left with no interesting poses or anything? Yeah, this is the same exact thing, but now in 3D, and sure, they sway just ever so slightly. There are so many Pokemon that completely lost their aura during the transition to 3D. Charizard went from, holy sh**, that's freaking awesome, to holy sh**, that's freaking lame. Even the long-awaited beast of Dragon-type Mega Charizard X looks like he belongs in a snow globe. Oh yeah, and remember what I said about Hippowdon earlier? They totally could have just made stand on all fours like all the other quadrupeds. Now I hate to complain without at least pointing out things that I think were actually done well. Mr. Mime has to be one of the best 3D models we got, as the 3D really helps accentuate the miming motions he's doing, since you aren't just looking straight on like you would in 2D. Hoppip just becomes a helicopter. Yanma, Ninjask, and some of the airborne bugs now flutter at super high speeds, making it much easier to imagine that annoying fly buzzing sound whenever you have them sent out. Duskull looks insane, where you can now see his eyeball drift from one socket to the other, and that just adds a brand new layer of creepy. They actually did a pretty good job of making Burmy and Wormadam look like they're hanging from a tree instead of just floating like everyone else. And while I loved the way Clink looked in black and white, I actually really appreciate how his gears turning now is more jerky and not as smooth. He feels a bit more mechanical that way. One other thing I actually really appreciate about the switch to 3D is that we can now see the Pokemon like fully in battle. And what I mean by that is it was always a letdown to have to look at the back sprite when the front-facing ones were always the more interesting ones. But thanks to the new dynamic camera angles introduced for the battles, the models were really brought to their full potential and we didn't just have to look at their backs the entire time. I also have to at least mention that this was their first time trying to make a 3D mainline Pokemon game, which as far as I understand, is a whole lot more difficult and time-consuming than 2D. And if you really think about it, it can be harder for 3D designs to be more expressive, because since they're more realistic, it leaves less up to our imagination. I don't think 3D models were great, but I think it's important to acknowledge all these different factors that were really holding them back. But moving into the next generation, the 3D models had the chance to move forward and become a whole lot more interesting. They're the exact same! They're the exact same again! While the games look leagues better now on the Switch, the models themselves didn't really get changed a lot. A ton of them do this same repetitive back and forth sway that they've been doing for a third generation in a row. Don't get me wrong, in Sword and Shield they look fantastic. The graphical quality is genuinely impressive and incredible. They do still look cartoony, but it's polished up to look much better than it did on the 3DS. And while there aren't really any interesting textures, the Pokemon have this almost toy-like, rubbery, plasticky appearance that's honestly kind of satisfying in its own right. However, while I think this does make the Pokemon look great, it's more of a compliment to Sword and Shield's graphics rather than any changes actually made to the models. There are, however, a few saving graces where some of the Pokemon definitely had a little bit more imagination going into them. Such as Phalanx with his Darth Vader looking Imperial March, Mr. Rhyme's tap dancing extravaganza, and Milcery with, well, whatever you call this, but it's still better than the majority of the others. And real quick, I gotta backtrack to some really good Generation 7 models while I'm at it. Every Oricorio form is very intentional with its pose to signify the different inspirations, and each one comes across beautifully. Passimian is perfectly placed in position to win the Super Bowl for the Patriots, and Incineroar taunts his opponent in true heel fashion, as if he knows exactly what he is doing to the mental sanity of anyone that plays against him in VGC. Overall, Generations 6 through 8 just were sadly mediocre, and didn't have their own individual identity. But in the following generation of Pokemon, everything was about to change for real this time. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's models might just be the most underrated aspect of these games. People have had complaint after complaint about how these Pokemon games look, especially regarding the lackluster landscapes. And these are very valid criticisms. But I think whatever effort wasn't put into the landscapes was instead put into the actual Pokemon. And not nearly enough people recognize that. After all, the game is called Pokemon, not a bunch of hills and mountains. There are a bunch of incredible textures and details here that are just never before seen for a Pokemon game. The most famous example, I think, is the new metallic textures on all the steel types. So many Pokemon that we've always kind of known in the back of our heads had fur, but really just kind of looked more cartoony and rubbery, now finally have a little bit of a fur texture. It makes Snorlax look even fluffier than he already was. Plus, so many reptilian and fish Pokemon actually have a scale texture on them that looks super cool. I also think they were super intentional about giving new Pokemon really cool poses again. Take for example the Tinkatink line, who changed the way they hold the hammer as the line progresses, and the hammer gets heavier. I also love how Golden Go has his hand on his hip in that bright smile, when they totally could have just had both hands at his sides in a blank expression. Maschiff is easily one of the best new ones because the idea that he's trying to be intimidating, but ends up just looking adorable, comes across perfectly. And then King Gambit, who this might just be more of his design than his model, but him straight up sitting down effectively conveys him as the royalty he is, giving orders from the comfort of his throne. Similarly, I think some of the models regain their energy and liveliness. One of my favorite examples is Toedscruel with its springy and bouncy idle animation. And of course, I couldn't go without mentioning Quaquaval, who always has that salsa dance absolutely on lock. This generation also did an incredible job of correcting the mistakes of earlier 3D games, breathing new life into a lot of the Pokemon, with some different poses and a return to more exaggerated expressions. It definitely felt like they went out of their way to fix certain mistakes that were commonly complained about, especially regarding the starters. With Typhlosion finally getting his Flame Crest back, and Blastoise using his cannons for certain water-type moves. Plus, Charizard regained his fierce, imposing aura, and Venusaur got back his mischievous grin. Scarlet and Violet are by no means perfect, and the models are no exception, but they are a step in the right direction, which is just really refreshing after what felt like a drought of creativity for years. I don't want to get too sentimental here, but looking back at all those years of sprites is like looking back at growing up for me, when all of a sudden there's just this dramatic shift and life is weirdly dull. But those lively and exciting years of childhood are still there, even if you don't think about them every day. Everything has its ups and downs. That's just the nature of life. And that's what makes the nostalgia of seeing older pixel sprites so much sweeter, because we had those years of lackluster 3D models. And while it's easy to bash them, I prefer to appreciate them for what they were at their place in time. For being the hypest and coolest thing I had ever seen as a kid in 2013. And I appreciate them for being a low point, because that also made the Scarlet and Violet models feel that much better, and made it genuinely exciting to see what 3D Pokemon games were capable of being. When I first saw the Pokemon in these games with all the new textures, it was like being that kid in 2013 again. And the new Pokemon were the most mind-blowing thing in the entire world to me. And that's all I could ever really ask for. Last but not least, I name dropped like 100 individual sprites that I thought were some of the best and most expressive, or just outright cool or cute. But that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the best ones across the series. So I want to hear your favorites in the comments, because it's inevitable that I glossed over some of the best ones ever made. And I'd really just love to hear the ones that you guys think are underrated and just deserve the spotlight more. As always, don't forget to subscribe while you're at it and like the video if you enjoyed it. And I'll see you all in the next one.